we spent a lot of time talking about his time as a commentator, his time as an authority figure, but I want to spend a bit more focus on actually how influential he was in wrestling, because I mean, as you said, I mean, he was this terrifying force of nature inside the ring, and then he had a lot of backstage influence and ownership of the company. So can you talk us a bit more around kind of Gino in the 60s and kind of how actually integral he was to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation?
Yeah, so he first came to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the summer of 1963. And the thing about those years was, wrestling, as we all know, was very territorial back then. There was no national company. So that's another reason why he's best remembered as the commentator, not just because it's more recent, but because as the commentator, he was seen by a national and eventually global audience. As the wrestler, he was really not. He stayed in the Northeast mostly, especially once he became Gorilla Monsoon. He spent a little time on the West Coast. That's about it for about a year and a half. If you grew up in this part of the country, as I did, there was a lot of awareness, especially among older fans. Oh, yeah, what a wrestler he was. My dad knew who he was. Mm-hmm. Older fans knew who he was. But he was, the best way to describe it, he was the first monster heel in that company, especially produced in that company. And when we think of WWE today, maybe a little bit less today, but certainly all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, maybe even right up to the Attitude Era, monster heels, that was their bread and butter. We got to have these big babyface world champions and feed them these monsters. They even do it. They do it still, like you mentioned, the Bronson Reed thing. They're known for things like that, but Gorilla was the first. He was the first. He came in mid-63 because they needed an emergency replacement for Buddy Rogers. Bruno Sammartino had won the world title from Buddy Rogers, and they needed opponents for him. They were not members of the National Wrestling Alliance at the time, so they didn't have this supply chain of wrestlers from other territories. They really had to work independently. And Buddy Rogers' health was failing, and he also was a very political guy, and I think they were sick of dealing with him. And so Gorilla, or Gino Marella, had been wrestling in Japan on a tour in early 63 with Killer Kowalski, who was already well established in North America and had already been well established in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And so he helped make that connection. He brought Gorilla into the company right after they got back from Japan, and they paired him up with Bobby Davis, who had been a great early manager in those days. And they immediately turned him into a sensation. He had the feud with Bruno Sammartino put him on the map. They had their first match in October 63 at Roosevelt Stadium, which is an outdoor minor league baseball stadium in New Jersey. And, the match really turned heads and put him on the map. It was this chaotic match and this guy coming out of nowhere, and it ended with a DQ finish. So it was, and just chaos. And it was very open-ended. So they started taking it on the road, taking it to the Garden. They had 4 matches, main events at the Garden, and then came back in 67 and did 3 more. And wow. That doesn't count. And the Garden back in those days, too, for people that don't know, the monthly shows at Madison Square Garden, that was like the pay-per-view. That was like the premium live event. The biggest matches, the biggest shows back then were not televised. And so that was like big time. And that doesn't even count Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, Baltimore, all those big Northeast cities, Pittsburgh, where they were also taking the match. So in the 60s, you could say he was one of the top drawing heels in the business. The Sheik, who I also wrote about, was right up there as well, and probably number one as far as the top drawing heels. But Gorilla was right there. And, the stuff with Bruno is really what established him. He became known because you had the wrestling magazines out of New York, too. So he was on a lot of covers. He got a lot of press in the magazines. So there was even an awareness of him in other places, even if you didn't get to see him live. And that was his prime as a wrestler, really. He turned babyface in 1969. And the reason for that was that he had just bought into the company. They did it on the same day. They did it at the TV tapings on the night of the day that they signed the contracts, because they didn't want him to stay a heel, because heels get stale and they lose their heat and they fall down the card, especially back then. And he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to become like a Baron Mikel Cicluna who winds up as an enhancement guy. He wanted to still be a special attraction and also not have to be involved in a lot of main event storylines, because back then the world champions were typically baby faces. So it would be the heels that would get all the main events with them. So that was a conscious decision. But he bought in 25% of the company at the age of 32 in 1969.
Wow.
So, a lot of people think all these guys were the same age. They were not. Gorilla was young enough to be Vince Sr.'s son. He was considered the junior partner. He was the vice president of the Capital Wrestling Corporation, which was their corporate name, their corporate entity. So, and then in the 70s, you get him as the babyface special attraction, kind of like an Andre the Giant type, except not touring like Andre did. And that's where the Gorilla position starts to happen, because when he becomes part owner, it's not just a quiet position. He's not just in the background doing nothing. He is producing the shows. That's how we would look at it today. He is running the show. Mm-hmm. He is producing the TV shows. He's making sure all the big house show live events run smoothly. The Gorilla position is that table, like you said, right outside the ring area, or the curtain. And so he would send the guys out. He would talk to them when they came back. And in the days even before headsets and things, he would have to visually signal the referees and the wrestlers in the ring of what they had to do, or if it was time to finish up and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, that was a crucial role. Vince Sr. did not do stuff like that. He wasn't as much of a hands-on guy as his son. He really chose qualified people and he let them do their job. So Gorilla was his right-hand man in a very real way.
Before we get back on that, I just wanted to ask a question. Sorry, Ash. I was just thinking about the differences between the era gone by and today. If we were talking in today's world, or maybe not in the last kind of 2 or 3 years with how booking has changed, but certainly recent WWE, Gorilla Monsoon and Bruno Sammartino would have probably exchanged that world title a number of times. They'd have been on PLE after PLE after PLE. But we never saw Gorilla Monsoon become champion. Was there consideration for him as the monster heel beating Bruno? Or was that never possible with how popular Bruno was?
I don't think there was, because what they were concerned about was making Bruno as strong as they possibly could. They knew that he was the meal ticket. So the way, not all wrestling promotions did this, but the way the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and even the World Wrestling Federation in the 80s for a lot of it was booked was, it's not like today, where today they put the world title on you and it's basically a plan. They say, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're going to win it on this date. You're going to hold it for X amount of time, and then we're going to do this, and you're going to lose it to this guy, and then you get it back. Back then, the thinking was, we want our most popular babyface star. We're going to put the world title on him, make him a draw, and he is going to hold that title until either he can't physically do it anymore and he needs a break, or he loses his popularity and the fans start to become less interested and he's not a draw anymore. That was it. They didn't have an end date in mind. So the goal with Bruno was, this is the guy we have to hitch the star to, because we're a new company as an independent entity. We've broken out on our own. We're not part of the NWA. We need to make this thing work. We don't have Antonino Rocca anymore. He had been the star of the 50s. Buddy Rogers was a heel and he had flaked out. So Bruno was the man, but it wasn't going to work unless he had convincing opponents. Gorilla was the first of those, and there would be many, many more. Killer Kowalski, Baron Mikel Cicluna, Dr. Bill Miller, George the Animal Steele, guys like that would come in and out. But Gorilla was not only the first, Gorilla was the most frequent challenger of his entire title reign. So between 1963 and 1969, they had hundreds of singles matches. he was the most frequent challenger for Bruno. He was also, if you include tag team matches, he was his most frequent opponent, period, of his career. And in addition to the Roosevelt Field, they had all these matches in the Garden. They had a Texas death match. They had in Philadelphia, they had a stretcher match. They did all these kinds of brutal matches. And one of their Garden matches in May of 1964, it went 70 minutes, and they had to stop it because the curfew hit. Like in those days, and I think even today at the Garden, it's a union building. So if you go past 11 o'clock, you have to pay the union guys double time, and they don't like to do that. So in those days, they would just stop the show at 11. Whatever match was happening, it would just be stopped. And that's what happened to those guys. I'm not sure why they did it. It's very interesting because the match went so long, they had to cut a match that they had planned on the card to go after it, because a lot of times they do that at the Garden. The main event would not be the last match. And they went 70 minutes. Now, the WWF and WWE, they're not known for doing these big time limit draws like Ric Flair or Harley Race or those guys would do. It's very rare. There are a couple of them that Bruno did, and there has not been. It's the second longest, I think, singles match in the history of WWE, even till today. And the longest was a title defense that Bruno had against Waldo von Erich like a couple of years later. So they were both Bruno matches. And that's the match that really made him into what I call in the book a made man. Like they knew that he was money and he wasn't going to go anywhere, and he became very valued, because you're talking about a guy who was close to 400 pounds, 6'6". At that time, he would have been 26, 27. And he's in there going an hour and 10 minutes and in unrelenting action with Bruno. And he could hang with him all the way through. And both of those men would always call that match the greatest match of their career. And I really think, like I say in the book, that was the night where he became more than just the heel that was going to come through, lose a few matches, and then leave, which is what happened, 90% of the time, that he was going to be more than that.